thank you very much for coming to Balliol to give your talk. It was very fantastic, very interesting, and I think opened a lot of interesting questions about how your time at Balliol and how you progressed and become a Conservative MP. So the first question I have for you is, what do you think the legacy Margaret Thatcher's left behind? Is this a good legacy? Is this a bad legacy? And what effect do you think it'll have on the rest of the world and Britain?
I think there are two parts to that question. There's what kind of effect does the death of Thatcher have on the political class at the moment? What lessons does she teach politicians in terms of the way she did things? And there's also what is Thatcher's legacy for the country, which I think historians will debate for a long time. I mean, to take the last one first, I think it's easy to forget what kind of a state we were in the 1970s. So, lights were going out. I've spoken to constituents who were saying how their fathers used to tell them about closed shops. You couldn't get a job unless you were a member of a union. Bodies weren't getting buried because people were on strike. 3-day weeks. This was a different planet, completely different planet to when she left in 1990. So something happened between that time and 1990 to turn it into the world more or less as we know it now. And I mean, it's interesting how many facts get forgotten about Margaret Thatcher. The fact that under Wilson, mines closed at 3 times the rate as they actually did under Thatcher. The fact that manufacturing actually went up under Margaret Thatcher and then plummeted quite a lot under New Labour. So whatever your opinion of Thatcher is, it's interesting how key objective facts get buried in a kind of characterisation of what happened. And the truth is that Britain was on a very downward spiral, and a lot of the difficulties that were happening during Margaret Thatcher's time in office were probably going to happen anyway if we were going to resurrect ourselves. So how much she is responsible for that is an interesting question. But also I think those who say, as I would do, that Thatcher essentially resurrected our country from plummeting in terms of our status in Europe and the world, it's not to deny the pain and the hardship that people went through. And I think it's a big mistake to say that because Thatcher was a necessary influence on our country, that's to say that people's pain and suffering didn't exist. It did. Now, how much it would have existed, whether she hadn't come along or not, is another question. But I think essentially we're in a much better place now, and she's enabled us to take so many things for granted, and that is a great gift. But it also means that you don't thank the person who did it as much as you might. But the second thing is, what's the lesson she gives politicians? And I think in an era where politics in general, I think very much post the Blair era, who was a master of appearance, a master of communication, a master of upsetting nobody and doing the right thing for everybody, Thatcher, in contrast to that, was a woman who stood for what she believed in, told it like it was, and attracted great love and loyalty and also great hatred. And I think at a time when we have difficult choices again, perhaps political class are looking to see whether they should be slightly more robust and blunt about what they think, and not so fearful of being disliked.
So, building on Margaret Thatcher, she was the person responsible for the UK joining the European community. Do you think that the EU is a force for good in the world, or is it a force not so much good in a sense?
I think the concept of a united Europe working together on a global stage that's becoming more and more competitive is undoubtedly a force for good. Now the second question is, how do you implement that? And I think one of the issues that we're facing in the very understandable aftermath of 2 brutal world wars, that the ideology to have a very united Europe very understandably trumped the very, very rational, pragmatic look at how you do that. One of the key mistakes I think was made is, in all the ideology, we underestimated how different each of the component parts of the EU are. And instead of having an EU unity built on a sort of homogeneity of sameness amongst nation states, we should have been building on a sort of strength in diversity. I think that would have built a far more robust Europe, a far stronger Europe, and also far better relationships between those component parts. What you're seeing now, I suppose, is the straining of an artificial glue that held nations that were very unlike each other. I mean, the Greek attitude towards paying taxes is very different from the German attitude towards paying taxes. Neither's right or wrong in its own sense, but it's not sensible to glue them together in one homogeneous nation when the people aren't following. And I think it's very easy for a political elite from across those nations to have far more in common with each other than the people of those various nations have in common with each other as well. So I'm very concerned at the moment, to be honest, how the ideology of Europe is panning out, and the inflexibility that many partners feel, for understandable reasons, about being pragmatic about the way that partnership exists. So the idea of Europe, brilliant, but you need to be very pragmatic about how that works and recognise basic realities about the way different countries function and what our different strengths are.
Okay. It's very interesting you raised this, because I think there are lots of practicalities that need to be dealt with. But do you think it's worth the effort to continue with these practicalities for Europe? And one perspective is, how can the UK compete in terms of trade with big megaliths such as the US, such as Russia, such as China, such as India, when it's not part or not very closely integrated in a European system?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's why the idea of a Europe is so valuable. If you go to China or Africa, they don't talk about Britain or Germany, they talk about Europe, and they see it as a bloc. But the point is, unless Europe loosens up a bit and enables itself to become more competitive and deals with its currency issues better, Europe as a bloc will sink, and that would be a tragedy to see happen.
So moving on to a slightly different topic, and going to your talk, which was fantastic. I'd like to ask you, in your talk you mentioned the effects that the September 11th events had upon you as a student touring around America, which sounds like great fun, by the way. Do you want to just explain how that had an impact on you and how that changed your life and how you view the world?
People always ask me, am I political? Or was I political when I was young? And at the time I'd have said no. Looking back, I was, and it all depends on how you describe politics. If you describe politics by being obsessed with who's saying what about who in the political sort of bubble, then I wasn't political at all. But if you describe politics in terms of getting stuff done and changing the world around you, and questioning authority and questioning rules and wanting to change them when you think they're wrong, then I was always very political. So I went through university, and at school I didn't know what I wanted to do, except I knew I wanted to read classics, and I ended up at Balliol happily. And I loved it so much, it completely distracted me from the bigger question of what I was going to do when this dream life came to an end. So when I got to the end of my finals, suddenly I hadn't got a plan. And so I thought, what I'll do is I'll do a master's, and by the end of my master's I'll certainly know what I want to do. And then I went round America, as you say, and I was in America for 9/11, having been up the Twin Towers just a month before. And in a sense, as the plane flew into those buildings and shattered, I think, the naivety of America and the optimism and ideology of America in many ways, and shocked the world, in my own tiny distant way, it sort of flew into my own ivory tower of what I was about to do, which I'm sure would have been very interesting to do a study on Horace and Ovid, but probably wouldn't have contributed very much to the world around me, if I'm really fair about my ability in classics. And so I thought, the world is literally blowing up out there. I was very concerned about America's reaction, the simplicity of the good versus evil narrative that emerged the day after in all the papers. And so I saw two ways to influence the world. Media, which was about, driving how people think, how they see themselves, culture, and politics, which seemed to me to be full of the mechanisms of people talking to themselves and using particular language that gets repeated and reused, and lots of old men talking to each other in a room in Westminster. And I obviously thought that media was a slightly more exciting and more potent way to change things. I ended up working in entertainment TV and putting contestants into the weakest link, which wasn't changing the world in the way I had naively envisaged when I was just going into media. A political leaflet came through my door, and I'd always associated myself, well, I hadn't actually, it's that story. I associated myself at that point much more with a conservative ideology, I suppose, than Labour, which I saw to be pulling power away from the people to an elite. That was my perception of it anyway. And so I went along to a meeting and thought, well, this is better than TV, and this is possibly an avenue for me to be able to get things done, and sprayed my CV around to people saying, I'm miserable in my job, please can I have one in politics, and eventually it worked out.
Thank you very much for being interviewed for Voices of Oxford. I hope the best for the future, and I hope to see you as Prime Minister one day.
Thank you very much, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much.